Here's the infographics show to make some silly statements about the resurrection of Jesus.
But have the Gospels reliably preserved historical details throughout the ages? And are Paul's letters still in their original form and untampered with for the purpose of empowering a Christian agenda?
Well, a more important question than whether the original story is tampered with is whether the original story is true in the first place. Even if we have the original story pristinely preserved, it's still very unlikely to be true insofar as that original story is about a guy coming back from the dead.
So how can the various Gospels be reconcilable if they differ so much in their retelling of the empty tomb? It's important to note that only one of the Gospel accounts, John's, actually differs in any significant way. Matthew, Mark, and Luke weren't written side by side, but rather individually by different people.
They were written by different people, but they clearly copy off of one another. A lot of the stories in Mark, the earliest gospel, are repeated, albeit inconsistently, in Matthew and Luke. Also, none of these accounts claim that the gospel author was there and witnessed the empty tomb firsthand. These are not stories told from different firsthand perspectives, but rather inconsistent retellings of a story the gospel authors heard or read second or third or fourth hand.
Thus, it's unsurprising that they would slightly differ in their historical retelling. Neither of those three Gospels contradicts the other.
Yeah, they do. Mark says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. But Matthew says, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. You have to be capable of Olympic-level mental gymnastics to spin these two passages as not being contrary to one another. Also, the story in Mark contradicts itself. If the ladies told no one about what they saw, then how did the author of Mark find out about it?
They merely mention details important to them. While Luke seems to state that a group of women went to the tomb, Matthew and Mark don't omit the possibility. They simply focus on the two of the women in that group, important to the writer. Luke also does not say that the women are instructed to tell the disciples or to tell them to go to Galilee to meet Jesus there, but the omission of this detail doesn't mean it didn't happen.
But Mark explicitly says that it didn't happen.
As we can see then, the differences in the Gospel accounts are A. insignificant to the core facts, and B. largely an issue of focus, rather than irreconcilable discrepancies.
How do you reconcile the fact that in Mark it says that the ladies who saw the empty tomb didn't tell anybody? That contradicts Matthew, which says they ran to tell his disciples. It contradicts Luke, who says they told the disciples and the disciples didn't believe them. And it contradicts itself, given that there's no way for this story to end up in a gospel if they didn't tell anybody.
Further, if the Gospel accounts had been perfectly accurate to each other, they would have almost certainly been collaborated, seriously damaging their value as historical documents.
But historians agree that despite the discrepancies, they clearly copy from one another and also probably copy from other lost documents like the Q document.
Lastly, while no serious historian objects to the time gap between the Gospels and Jesus' death as being cause for concern over inaccuracy, many non-historian critics do. After all, how accurate can a historical account be if it's written decades after the subject's death? First, this is ignoring the strong oral tradition of ancient Jews. In the first century, very few people knew how to read or write, and thus many people would rely on oral retelling of history and especially of religious texts, with a very strong emphasis on accuracy. To a devout Jew, the thought of mangling Holy Scripture by poorly recalling it was an unthinkable heresy. This strong oral tradition would have been present in the early Christians as well.
Even if that's the case, that says nothing about the reliability of the original story. If the original story is made up or based on a mistake or delusion, then it doesn't matter how faithfully it's retold.
Next, while the earliest writings on Jesus date to 25 years after his death, the fact that we have at least 11 historical sources for Jesus within a century of his death makes Jesus of Nazareth the gold standard for ancient historians.
No, it doesn't. While most of the stories about Jesus are far more reliable than those about Moses or Noah, they are not as good as stories written by the historical figures themselves, or about those historical figures during their lifetime. Caesar, for example, not only produced his own writings, Cicero wrote about Caesar while he was still alive. And we have at least one visual depiction of Caesar that was probably produced during his lifetime. We have a bust that he could very well have sat that for? Even the historicity of Paul, the author of the epistles, is far stronger. Not only do we have several of his own writings, we have excellent reason to believe that we in fact have Paul himself. We have his remains. We have a coffin with Paul's name on it, buried where people at the time said he was buried, and with remains in it that carbon dating says are from the time Paul died. Now that's a gold standard for ancient historians. I believe that Jesus probably existed, but to say that he's the gold standard for ancient historians is to imply that no evidence for the historicity of other ancient figures surpasses the evidence for the historicity of Jesus. This is just not the case.
Simply put, to doubt the veracity of the historical account of the scripture is to put into doubt every single event of ancient history, as the life, death, and teachings of Jesus are the best sourced histories in the ancient world.
No, they are not. The best sourced histories are the ones that involve documents written by the historical figures themselves.
With the Gospels and letters of St. Paul accepted as valid historical documents,
Well, that depends on which letters from Paul. Some are accepted as valid. Some of the letters attributed to Paul are widely considered to be forgeries.
is there then any evidence for the resurrection as a historical event?
None so strong as to make it reasonable to believe it happened.
We can begin our investigation with the empty tomb. In the Gospel accounts, the tomb is discovered empty by Mary Magdalene. Jesus' burial clothes are there, but not the body. Critics have argued that the empty tomb was an early Christian fabrication and presented various theories as to what really happened. The first is that the entire empty tomb narrative is a fabrication. Yet this has been widely rejected by critical historians, as the scriptures themselves record Jewish authorities reacting to the empty tomb by claiming that the disciples had stolen the body, along with their own refutation of this claim.
There's a rebuttal of the claim, but not a refutation. Matthew says that there were guards at the tomb who were paid to spread the rumor that the body was stolen. What's more likely to be a lie, the claim that the disciples staged a hoax, or the claim that a guy actually rose from the dead?
Next is the claim that the Jewish Sanhedrin was right and the disciples did steal the body. This is frankly an absurd proposition, as guards had been posted to the tomb. In all likelihood, these were actually Jewish temple guards, as it's incredibly unlikely that Pilate would have bothered to involve Roman guards in what he saw as a purely Jewish religious dispute, and instead simply told the Sanhedrin to use the guards they already possessed themselves. The idea of disciples bribing Jewish temple guards successfully so as to perpetrate their heretical belief in a resurrected Messiah is incredulous to the point of sheer absurdity.
Yes, the idea that a guy came back from the dead is much more believable. I have my doubts, actually, that there were, in fact, any guards there in the first place. The guards at the tomb are not mentioned in Mark, the earliest gospel. They first appear in Matthew, the second gospel to be written. Matthew describes the guards as being frightened by the sight of Jesus and running away. Later in Matthew, the guards are paid to lie and say they fell asleep, and that's when the disciples stole the body, and that this lie they told persists among some people. Now, whether there were guards or not, whether Jesus was resurrected or not, it is clear that the mention of the guards was added to Matthew because the idea that the disciples stole the body was in circulation, and the mention of the guards being paid to say they fell asleep was to explain why people are saying that. Let's apply Occam's razor here. What's the simpler explanation for the claims that the disciples stole the body? Were people saying the disciples stole the body because they actually did steal the body? Or is it because a guy came back from the dead and some guards who were supposed to watch over his tomb got scared and ran away, and then were paid to tell everyone they fell asleep and that his friends stole the body? If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, is it a duck? Or did someone pay a chicken to look and quack like a duck? What's the more probable explanation here?
Let alone bribing Roman guards who would themselves face death for such a massive dereliction of duty when the tomb was found empty.
But Matthew says that they got scared and ran away and were paid to lie about it rather than punished. If they really faced execution, why is Matthew's claim credible?
The next theory is the apparent death theory. This theory states that Jesus didn't really die on the cross and instead survived his crucifixion, somehow slipped past the tomb guards, and returned to the disciples who celebrated him as the resurrected Son of God.
Instead, I guess we're to believe that he actually came back from the dead and somehow got past the tomb guards.
So is the empty tomb narrative accurate? There's no realistic reason to believe that Jesus' body was stolen or that Jesus survived his crucifixion.
How are either of those less realistic than the idea that he came back from the dead?
Without an empty tomb, there could be no Christian narrative of resurrection. As a well-known figure due to his perceived blasphemy and heresy, the site of Jesus' burial would have been known to anyone looking to debunk the disciples' earliest claims of resurrection. And all the Jewish authorities would have had to do to shut the entire Christian movement down as soon as it arose was to simply unseal the tomb and show that Jesus still lay there, dead, and that the disciples were liars.
How would that work if someone stole the body?
It's important to note who discovered the empty tomb as well: women. In the very patriarchal society of the ancient Jews, women were not regarded as credible witnesses in court. Both Jewish historian Josephus and Jewish philosopher Maimonides made it clear that women were not competent to testify in court. As Josephus pointed out, testimony of a deaf, mentally incompetent, or young person as well as women was excluded in most cases.
It's not clear that the women ever even gave a testimony. In Mark, the ladies are told to tell people that Jesus' tomb was empty, but then it says they told no one.
The earliest disciples saw the risen Jesus. I don't know how exactly they saw him, but they saw him. Most critics, including 20th century atheist philosopher Anthony Flew, ascribe to the hallucination theory to explain the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. This theory posits that the disciples were stricken with grief-inspired hallucinations and confused them as the real bodily appearance of a risen Jesus. There are, however, serious problems with that theory. First, any belief in Jesus' resurrection due to hallucination could have been easily dispelled by Jewish authorities by simply checking the tomb and finding the body still resting there.
Not if somebody stole it.
Second, as is established by medical science, hallucinations cannot create new ideas. They simply work within the pre-existing mental framework. As devout Jews, the disciples had no belief, let alone an idea, of a bodily resurrection that predated the end of days. In the Jewish faith, resurrection only occurred on the last day, as God cast his judgment and called the faithful to live in paradise. Before this event happened, there could be no resurrection of the dead.
I hear this argument a lot that Jews at the time had no reason to believe that their Messiah would die and rise from the grave because the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah don't say anything about that. While it's true that there's nothing in the prophecies about the Messiah that state this, although it's weird that Christian apologists use this argument that Jesus does not match the prophecies if they want us to believe that he fulfilled the prophecies, you have to ignore several gospel passages in order to believe that Jesus' disciples specifically never expected him to rise from the grave. The Gospels claim that Jesus firmly planted the idea in their heads that this would happen. In Matthew, not only does Jesus purportedly resurrect people himself, he apparently gives resurrection powers to his followers and tells them to go around bringing people back from the dead. And Matthew 16:21 says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." So this idea that Jesus' followers would have had no belief in a bodily resurrection before the end of days is unambiguously contradicted by Scripture. It's entirely possible that one or a few of the followers stole the body, then used that to exacerbate the expectation in the rest of the followers that Jesus rose from the dead. That's certainly a more plausible hypothesis than an actual resurrection.
Therefore, a hallucination could not have convinced a devout Jew that the event for which he had no basis for believing in had occurred.
Their belief that Jesus went around resurrecting people and that he gave them the power to resurrect people themselves, and that he told his disciples that he himself would be killed and resurrected was no basis for believing in his resurrection?
Secondly, the odds of all his disciples, or at least enough to jumpstart the Christian church, all suffering from grief hallucinations are astronomical to the point of once more absurdity.
Unlike the odds of a guy actually rising from the dead, which I guess we're to believe are somehow far less absurd. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.